Why is it so difficult to study traditional architecture in school today? Who was Edwin Lutyens, arguably England's greatest architect? What was so unique about Victorian architecture in America, and why did it vanish after the Chicago World's Fair in 1893? And what can students of architecture do today who have an interest beyond what the academies are concerned with teaching? Welcome back. I'm Alexander. I teach drawing to architecture students. And recently, I sat down with a good friend of mine, Trace Chitwood, to talk about all of these things. And during that conversation, we'll continue rendering the primary elevation of the La Neuville War Memorial, designed by Lutyens, and based on measured drawings done by Trace, who took a ruler to Europe last summer and documented it by hand.
I don't understand people who have the ability to rub shoulders with like the heights of like an industry and do it so naturally without seeming to be disgenuine. I don't have that power. I just want to stay home and do things and on my own terms and
this is why you and I get along.
Stay alone. Just leave me alone. I want to stay home and drink some coffee and tea. Let's go.
So, okay, let's talk about Lutyens. Lutyens is someone whose name I had not heard until I was in professional practice working for classical architects, which is kind of a travesty, I think, right?
It really is.
You went to Catholic U.
Yes.
Where did you encounter Lutyens first?
It's actually funny. I encountered him first in Houston. I was working for an architect there named Michael Ta, and he has a pretty decent little library of his own. He's an alumni from the University of Houston. I went there for my undergrad, and I met him because he was a professor there who was working as a invited instructor during someone else's maternity leave. So when he took over the studio, we became acquainted with one another, and we became interested in possibly, I became interested in working for him after school, and we've kept in touch ever since. And he let me borrow some of his books, and one of the books he had was one of the older monographs on Lutyens's country houses, the first volume. It's like one of the older 1990s ones that are really hard to come by.
You're lent some books by this architect, you're digging through them, and one of the treasures is an old monograph on Lutyens, and this is the first time you encounter him.
And it was back in undergrad that I was interested in traditional, well, that's why I wanted to pursue architecture, was because of traditional vernacular work. And when you go to a modern school like the University of Houston, all the professors, you look at you like you're an alien. They tell you that you can't do that. How dare you even think that? And this Michael Ta was one of the few that also had interest in that. He didn't know anything about it or how to practice it exactly, but he had books on it. And he lent a lot of books to me, and he was one of the ones that told me that I should go apply to grad school at Catholic U.
You're at Houston, you're an undergraduate. It's a modernist program, for lack of a better term. It's teaching modernist orthodoxy like most schools are. Is this, so you encounter Lutyens, but was this also sort of you encountering classicism, traditional architecture, or had you a notion that that was a thing that could be done?
That's a great question. At the University of Houston, I was taught in the not Beaux-Arts way, the Bauhaus method, and like very antiquated approaches to modernism, where it's more on these very arbitrary ways of going about designing that has nothing to do with really how architecture is really built and done, and nothing in tradition, just extremely abstract to the point where it's completely separate from the building craft.
Well, to your point, I think a lot of that generation of professors who were teaching modernism in that way, they were taught themselves that same worldview, that same mentality at a time when, like, the Fountainhead was extremely popular and influential, right? And in the opening chapters of the Fountainhead, you have Howard Rourke, who is getting, as a student, sick of what Ayn Rand calls studio projects where the students are just required to draw Italian postcards over and over again. This idea that studying history is an odd mimicry, that it's bereft of any kind of education, that there's nothing to be learned from it, that you're sort of being rapped on the knuckles for not, following the rules, and there's no point to the rules. I worked for a modernist architect in Phoenix for a time, and he, the way he put it was, he liked to fancy himself as like, I can do modernist or I could do traditional. And when he talked about traditional architecture, it was, we'll use an established language. And if we're doing a modernist house, we'll invent the language. Because that, which I thought was kind of a clever way of pointing out, there's this notion that classical architecture is an established manner of being, a way of doing things, a way of interacting with the world. And again, to your point, it deals a lot with how things are built, right? Classicism is sort of downstream from vernacular. Something that's classical is the vernacular raised to the station of nobility, of high art, of high culture, right? Classicism is sort of the established language. Traditionalism is the language of those things. Modernists are swiping that off the table, and they'll make their own language.
It's completely just pulled out of nothing and thin air, and they drop it down, and that's the way it is. With me in architecture was I wanted to pursue it because I saw what was around me. My dad had rental properties in Galveston, and I was so impressed by the eclectic nature of all the architecture there. Some of the best in the state, really, especially Victorian era architecture. And I worked for the Historical Foundation there as a volunteer for a while, in some architectural salvage. And it was really then I wanted to pursue architectural professionally. And then
Was this before your undergraduate degree?
Yes, this was when I was high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So from high school, you went into undergraduate, into that program with sort of an interest in architecture history.
When I was a junior in high school, I knew I wanted to practice architecture.
Okay.
I was dead set on it.
And then you found yourself at Houston surrounded by all these modernists.
I had no idea.
Didn't want you to study what you were interested in.
I should have done more research on that. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. It wasn't until I was there. It's like, this is horrible.
We were kids. How could you have known?
I had no idea. And also to practice great architecture, you have to go and look at great architecture and understand scale, proportion, materials. And then if I found an architect that his work was really good, I would go seek out all his other buildings. Like one of my favorites here in Texas was James Riley Gordon, who at age 26 did his first courthouse in Port Aransas, and then he went on to do I think 18 other courthouses across the state. And I just was really fascinated by the way he designed everything from the plan to the exterior. He let his masons, he specified in his drawings that the masons could have free range on grotesques and the carvings, and that they could go all out on whatever they wanted. So if you ever go to Waxahachie, that building has some really cool carvings on it that are all in sandstone, and they're they're from the beautiful all the way to the hideous grotesques.
And this was the work of the masons to their taste.
Oh yeah, just whatever they wanted to do. But that's the type of stuff that made me want to pursue architecture, and it was a shame that my undergraduate it wasn't until I got into grad school that I finally found people of similar interests and mindsets.
So you sort of had this interest in traditional architecture, found that to be not such an easy thing to pursue at just any program, and in working for this architect thereafter encountered Lutyens' work. And okay,
exactly.
Tell me about Lutyens. I think a lot of students who don't have the kind of education that you would get at a program like Catholic U or other traditionally minded programs, which is most of them, miss studying figures like Lutyens. Why is Lutyens so important?
This is a great question. Oh, I will answer that, and I'll also give it a little introduction too. So Lutyens was born 1869. And he was in a very poor area of Surrey, in a very poor family.
Really?
And he had many siblings, and I think he was one of the younger ones, if I remember correctly.
He was 10th out of 13, I think.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. I didn't know that they weren't particularly well to do.
And it's actually it was something that he was kind of ashamed of, and he tried to hide when he became older. And it wasn't really until he got married to a woman who had a family of higher status that he kind of became more how do you say in a better social standing through his wife, and also was better connected for clientele. But he was, the thing that I find fascinating about Lutyens is he had no formal training whatsoever. It was all self-interest. He went around Surrey with glass and soap, and he drew on that vernacular architecture to get understandings of the proportion, massing, the detail.
I'm curious if Lutyens devised this manner of sketching himself, or if it was something that was inspired by, for example, you're looking at something, you're trying to draw it, and this thing through your eye is in perspective, right? And how do you render it to a flat surface? And so one of the first machines that was invented to do this, they would take, it was something that would sit on the table, and it was like a frame, and the frame was on a hinge that could swing. And so what would happen is, like if I were trying to draw your coffee cup, I would take my pencil and I would place it at my eye line at the rim of the cup, and I would take this thing and swing it shut, and it would put a dot on the page. And then I would move it and swing it shut, and it would put another dot. And so like this, I would stipple in perspective and create a kind of connect the dots, and then you take the paper out.
Got it. Yeah.
And this was, it's almost identical to what Lutyens was doing with this pane of glass and a bar of soap.
Instead he's hold it up in this sketch. Yeah, that's
You're
amazing.
trying to commit these things to, and even if you don't know what you're doing, there's only so many of those drawings you can trace from real life before you start to understand what a vanishing point is, what a horizon line is.
It's fascinating to me how intelligent he was for having no formal training, because in the books, there's many books on Lutyens, but the ones I've read, it talks about later in his career how on the buildings that he calculated indices for, like the bank building at the Midland Bank, now the Ned Hotel, and then also the Cenotaph, and a lot of his other buildings have indices in this very peculiar way, and to translate it for constructability for a mason, he calculated out like pages and pages of these calculations. And someone who's so well with math and geometry that have no formal training and be able to do something like that is impressive. And
for it to be the result of intuition.
And there's no one that really has any information on where he's given this. I think he's just born naturally a genius. I guess. But to back up and go back a little bit, I wanted to say that early on, really what established his career was in 1889, he was at a garden tea party in Surrey where he met Gertrude Jekyll, he was in his, I think he was like 20 years old, and Jekyll was in her late 40s. And two very unlikely people to connect, but they became really well connected, and it was through Jekyll that he got his first commission, was her own home.
Really? That was his first?
That was one of her...
She had a great influence on him early on, but I didn't know the character of it.
Yeah, it was basically one of his first commissions, and through that, he was able to learn how to work with the tradesmen of Surrey. They gave him a lot of information on just how framing and other basic principles of just constructing things, but it was through that their partnership as a friend team for landscape design spanned over the next 40 years of their career together.
She was the landscape architect of choice for him throughout
basically
his entire career.
Yeah, she designed everything in terms of landscaping for all his major projects, even for the Wargrave cemeteries.
Really?
Yeah.
She was involved in those as well?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is something, maybe we can to move to this. You brought this to my attention first about Lutyens, that he was working as an architect. On the one hand, he was doing these amazing residential commissions. He was also doing eventually civic commissions. But that throughout the course of his career, almost in parallel, he was designing dozens and dozens of World War I memorials.
Oh, yeah.
How did he come into that? Where did he get that commission?
So he's mostly known for his country homes, and that was really what established his career. He was known for that. And through his marriage, he got connections with the Viceroy of India, and he was with those types of people through his wife. Like around, I think it was around like it was in the 1910s. He got that. I forgot the exact story, but he was, because of that large commission, they knew that he could work on a scale of civic architecture.
Okay.
And it was that led him to get to be put on for the Wargraves commission with the other four architects that he worked alongside
after the war, there is a commission established with multiple architects who are tasked with designing these monuments, memorials, cenotaphs, and one of them is Lutyens.
Yes, and this is something that he becomes like one of the official architects for, and he worked for them from like the 1910s all the way into the late 30s, and I think even till his death, if I remember correctly, because I know it's in his... What's the name of something when someone dies? And it's in the newspaper. It's like
the obituary.
Obituaries, yes, it's in his obituary. I can't remember the name of that. And just impressive, the scale of the work that he's done for the Imperial War Graves Commission that's relatively unknown or unheard of, and it's not really documented anywhere except for 2 books. There's 2 books that came out in the last, like, I want to say 20 years or maybe 30 years, which is relatively new. I mean, for someone who died in 1944, for that work not to be mentioned in any publication until basically living memory is wild to me.
Insane. Especially for something of such national importance.
Yes.
He designed, I mean, do you know the number off the top of your head? I think it's 52 memorials.
Oh my goodness. I used to know the number, but it's an impressive amount.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. And a lot of the work that he did for the majority of the work was completely on his own expense.
Really?
That's why he was knighted.
That's amazing.
I
never knew that. So he did this at his own expense and was knighted more or less on account of that.
Yes, and there's a new book that was published. If you want to get like a basic understanding of Lutyens and his career, there's a new book that came out recently. Oh, I'm blanking on the author. I just read it like front to cover like a month ago. It's a wonderful book. I think it's called "Is Lutyens Britain's Greatest Architect?" ? And it gives you an introduction to his career, and it has newfound information that tells you about things that are not typically known to older writers like Gavin Stamp wrote about Lutyens, or the official monograph author Hussey. So that's a really great read. It's a short read, and it would get you a really good understanding of his broad career, including that story.
So tell me about, so you applied for the Lutyens Trust, you won the grant, and you traveled to document 10? 12?
It was like 10 or 11, if I remember right now.
Yeah.
I'm starting to forget. It was a lot. I initially had applied to do 6.
Yeah.
And it led to that many.
Right. Well, so long as you're in the neighborhood. Right?
I know, when I was there, I couldn't help myself. I'd go by one, and I'm like, I have to see that thing. I never thought in my wildest dreams I was going to win. I'm this person that kind of has a self-deprecating character. I thought, I wasn't going to win, but then delightfully found out to win. And I not only did more work than I initially had applied for, but I think I set a new bar for their basic level of submittals for following trust winners.
I think
for
that
the
goes
fellowship.
without saying. The work that you did is really phenomenal. Even down to replicating, creating a new font to replicate Lutyens's lettering by hand, so that your plates would have his hand on them and not have some stock font. It's really insane, the level of detail that you put into the work. But
I wanted people in architecture to look at my plates and get them confused with actual drawing out of the monograph, and it worked, because some of the people on the Lutyens Trust Commission, they thought it was
your work.
Yeah.
This is something that, and I want to pick your brain about this, and I want to kind of move to talking about precedent. This idea that you wanted your plates to be indistinguishable from Lutyens' plates, right? That is how to do this justice. That's how to have reverence and respect for Lutyens. It's how to properly presume to insert yourself into Lutyens' work and add something to it, even if it's historiography, right? That you have to have some level of deference to the artist, to the architect. We've heard this from a couple of architects that we've worked with, who I think we both have a lot of respect for, that, for example, to design the kind of things that you wouldn't be able to tell them apart from an actual historical building, because they're so well educated, they belong there to such a degree that there's really not a meaningful difference between a Cape Cod house that was built in the colonial era and this hypothetical house that we're designing now. And it's the same attitude that you're describing. I want people to confuse my plates with Lutyens' plates.
Exactly. I think that's the best thing an architect could really do in their career. I remember I was at an ICA tour in Baltimore, and I went to a house that was being restored by Everett Schramm, and he was there at the house with the client. And I walked in, did the whole tour, and at the very end I went up to him and I said, "Everett, you did such a wonderful job here, but what exactly did you do here?" And he said, he put his hand over his heart. He's like, "Oh, Trace, that's the best compliment I've ever received my entire career." And I think that's the thing, is if you can do an addition to a building or in a neighborhood of historic context, and you can do a home or building that's infill that could look like it has been there ever since is something that's about as good as an architect can get. I remember when I was in undergrad and they told us to go look at all these modernist buildings around us, like I'd go see Mies van der Rohe's addition to the original Museum of Fine Arts building. It's I think the original architect was William Watkin, who was a professor at Rice, and it's this neoclassical building. It's very nice. And then Mies just slams on his big, steel and glass building. It's funny, it's like all glass for housing works of art, and right when it was finished, they put up these giant curtains and close out all the glass, and it hasn't been opened ever since. But I remember, you look at the scene between his building and the neoclassical one, and there's this clearly absolutely no thought of how those two buildings merge. Even the floor plates inside don't align, and there's a lot of weird...
sort of garishly grafted onto the side.
Yeah, but then if you go look at architects before, the international style had become a thing, like I remember there's a building that James I. Gordon did in Pennsylvania. There's a courthouse. It's like his only courthouse, I think, in Pennsylvania. The original building's like this 1870s kind of pavilion courthouse where it has the four corners and a main tower. And then he came on, I want to say over 40 years later, and he designed 3 new courtrooms that were added onto. And the only thing that's different, that's unique, is it has curving walls. It has elliptical courtrooms. But the materiality and the details are the exact same as the original building. So if you were to look at it, you would think that was always there. And the seams of it are just impressively convincing that it's always been that way.
It seems like what you're suggesting, and tell me if you agree with this, is that there's a certain degree of selflessness that it takes to practice good architecture, especially good traditional architecture, classicism, where you have to be willing to kind of remove yourself from it. You have to be willing to say, I don't need to carve my name into the facade of this building. I don't need to say, this is done by me now here.
Yes.
And what was here before is other else and over there. And the substance of my work as an architect is violently confronting it.
Exactly. And I feel like that's what almost every modern architect does today. I mean, I could name you so many examples of that. And there's a time and a place for that. Especially if it's a new building, if it's deserving of that. But if it's something like at the H.H. Richardson designed Kirkbride Asylum in Buffalo, New York, they're restoring that, and some architect did a new entrance, and they did this horrible glass box nonsense on one side of it, and it's just why would you do that? I mean, it's a beautiful building. You just had to put your mark on it in some way that now everyone that goes by is what is that? Ugh.
There's a book that I read when I was working on my undergraduate thesis called The Possibility of an Absolute Architecture by O'Reilly. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. And there's a line in this book where he says that something to the effect of great architecture must be of its time. The idea that good architecture has to always announce itself and has to always be unmistakably of a certain moment in time, I couldn't disagree more at this point in my career. It should be timeless. This is what the ancients were striving for in ritual, in the way they designed the temple, the way you process through the temple. It was to bring the architecture into alignment with the cosmos, in the sense that the world would never come apart, and so the building would never come apart. Permanence and timelessness was the object of architecture with a capital A, all the way up until very recently. This idea that architecture should behave the opposite is a very new idea. It's a very characteristically modern idea.
When was that book published?
Oh, I think it was published in 2010.
Oh, it's very new.
It's new.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think architects, even ones from the 19th century, had a mindset of that, but it came for technology, constructability, like the early skyscrapers, and how steel at that point was these riveted structures instead of the typical beams you see nowadays, and the use of incandescent light bulbs coming out and being used in public spaces where that wasn't a thing before, or Chicago's World's Fair and the use of more Italian and Beaux-Arts, sculpture applied to architecture, which was something that had not been really used a lot in America for most of the Victorian period, and they really brought that back. And Frank Furness went to the World's Fair as a critic to judge the architecture, and when he saw the sculpture there, he was actually working on Broad Street Station, and he convinced the clients to spend money to put neoclassical sculptures on the exterior of Broad Street Station, and he hired one of the official art sculptors running the fair, Carl Bitter, to design
in Chicago.
Yeah,
Carl Bitter.
Carl Bitter did the sculptures for the train station in Philadelphia. But now architects, they don't have the mindset for, it's not about, it's stylistic. It has nothing really to do, I mean, technology's still there, but it's like, it has to be stylistically modern, not just the technology behind, assemblies, I guess.
Do you think that this may be a question that's too provocative to have any substance, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you think that the Chicago World's Fair has it been downhill since then? Was that the pinnacle of the American architectural spirit?
Well, I think in some ways it kind of destroyed the American interest in developing an American architecture. Like, as it was coming up to that, there was so much different eclectic, very personal styles that were being dominated across the country. If you look at that time period leading up to 1893, the height of architectural magazines, it was looking at ancient Spain. It was like H. Richardson was the architect of the country at the time. He was influencing everyone to do medieval Romanesque revival buildings. Okay. Or like Frank Furness was doing his own thing, and he was the biggest firm in Philadelphia, and his architecture there dominated that city in the skyline. And it was something extremely personal. I was looking at medieval France and England. Louis Sullivan, who was also someone who worked for Furness, went to Chicago and was doing his own architecture there, and he did the transportation building at the World's Fair. And it was the only building at the fair that wasn't a neoclassical building, really. It was one of his, looking at Byzantine, looking at different things from medieval architecture, but abstracting the ornament into his own thing. And it wasn't until really the 1893 World's Fair where it was like academic classicism, and you couldn't do Victorian architecture anymore. And that became where all these architects after that poo-pooed Victorian architecture. That's why like Frank Furness and Richardson fell out of favor, and that was kind of a sad thing because that direction was so inventive and unique to America. And then there's not that there's anything wrong with like
strict classicism.
Strict classicism, or that also like after World War I, the academic approach to like it has to be like exactly verbatim details in England and France. It can't be spun into like this kind of romanticized Victorian flourishes. It has to be academically, that's the profile, that's the precedent. It has to look exactly like that, because that's what really happened from like...
How do you differentiate, maybe even for students who are listening, when you're sort of contrasting classical architecture at that period with Victorian architecture? How would you differentiate them in like layman's terms? Like, what is it about Victorian architecture that was so...
Well, Victorian architecture is it's just so inventive and playful. And it's a lot of looking at the past.
It's educated,
but they're spinning it in their own way, and they're doing very inventive things. And also the Victorian, especially residential architecture, was so cataloged. Like you could look at a profile from the 1890s in a house in like West Texas that was manufactured by some company, and that molding catalog was available across the country, and every lumber house had that profile. So it was something that was formulated. It was formulated. In terms of classicism too, even today, there's a lot of people who are very strict with the rules, and it's very textbook, and it's like you can't really go further more than that. And then there's other people that really play with things. They mix different time periods, Greek and Roman, together. To practice good architecture, I think you have to know examples of both and go your own route on how to go forward. But you shouldn't get so stuck. Like Lutyens, I think, was a good example of someone who he knew what he was doing. I think he looked at he had treatises that he practiced from, but he would close the book and he would start designing. And he was able to be very inventive and playful with the orders, probably because of that.
A lot of contemporary architects, even ones who consider themselves classicists, I think, will open a book. They'll say, let's look at the precedent. They'll pull a book, they'll open it up, they'll look at something of a period, and they'll say, we'll do this. Let's do that. Right? It doesn't seem like Lutyens was the kind of person to do that. As you say, with Victorian architecture, at least the way we've been talking about it, it's a kind of a revelry in education.
Yes. And use of precedents, I know Lutyens gate kept, and he never really wrote anything much. He did write a little bit, but he was one that he let his own work speak for itself. And then some of these modern contemporary writers, talking about him have tried to find some of his precedents. And there's a couple, especially in his late works, where he was looking at this one Italian Renaissance architect. I'm blanking on the name. Some of his buildings, he did look at the specific one example of something, and then he did something based off that, but it was very different. But you could see there was some inspiration for like maybe some different components of like the rustication and maybe the bays and some of the window treatments. Architects like Frank Furness, it's just so crazy when you look at his buildings, because he was literally looking at like Leduc. He's looking at his dictionaries on ornament, and you can find things from like abbeys and monasteries from France for ornament, but then like the massings, like something of a completely different time period. His academy for the fine arts in downtown Philadelphia, one of his early like major buildings, is just such a wild, exuberant mix of styles, mixing craft with also industrial age materials, looking at machinery, big machines like pistons and great steam engines, and then also mixing it with like medieval profiles is something that he did. And it's just so, and also his ornament was something where he didn't really look at a pattern book. He didn't write much either, but one of his early published essays on ornament, he talks about how you would go to a garden and grab a flower, and you would take it in front of you, trace it a couple times at profile, like plan an elevation and side elevation, and then at one point after you do that, you just take it away, and you, from memory, you develop your own ornament from that flower.
Yeah.
So all his ornament, all his buildings are completely custom, and it's something that he derived as his own personal take for ornament. It's amazing how so personal all his work is.
But the attitude here then is study very carefully, but then don't copy, right?
Yeah, at least that's what his process was.
For the modernists, it seems like there's no study necessary, simply do.
Yeah,
right?
Don't look at anything, just pull out of your own.
But then for some traditionalists who maybe are doing work that is not so invigorating or not so invigorated, it's simply study, copy.
Studying, there are some that do that, and I think that could hinder your work. I think you have to be a little more flexible.
Well, what do you think students can take from this conversation about Lutyens in particular, and about this idea of like how to approach architecture?
I would say go travel first off. It doesn't have to be over in Europe. I'd say go look at the older buildings around you. Go online and search up your county and then National Register of Historic Places, and it'll give you a list of all the buildings in your immediate area that are old and they're good, and you can go visit them. If there's house museums, go look at them. If they're courthouses, go look, because
you can walk inside.
You can walk inside. You can get a sense of scale. You can understand what the materiality is for your local area, and then photograph, draw, take a sketchbook, pencil, and a ruler, and measure things that you're interested to get a sense of scale and proportion for things. Because that's really, I think, what the modernists lack. They design in a vacuum. They have nothing to scale. That's why a lot of their buildings just seem so inhuman. I think there's a humanity to traditional architecture that is completely lacking in any modern works, because they're machines for living in.
Really great.
Man,
this is a great conversation.
This is really fun.
Yeah, we should have done this more sooner.